Hello, welcome to Club E. Hi, I'm Rick Brimacombe of Brimacombe and Associates. I am your architect of business growth. Today, we're going to be talking about how to know your cash. But first, I want to thank our sponsors. Irish Titan is an e-commerce and web development firm. Boulay Group, CPAs and advisors. Highland Bank, a locally owned community bank. Minnesota Sales, a sales acceleration firm. Romaine Berg, a digital agency, and the Network Connect, a catalytic gateway for connecting businesses, companies, cash, and job seekers. Anyway, I would like to introduce to you today's speaker. John Morris is a certified business transition expert and partner at B2B CFO. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. John's contact info is in the comments field. But for those of you taking notes, it's John Morris at b2bcfo.com. But again, you can find that contact info in the comments section. All right, John, tell us a little bit about yourself, your firm, your background, and the various activities that you're involved in.
So B2B CFO is a national partnership of people who've been CFOs. And we've been around for about 30 years. I've been with the firm for about 8, and I help clients in a fashion that's sometimes called fractional CFO. I prefer more the term maybe advisory CFO or consulting CFO. I want to give people the impression that as a consultant or an advisor, I'm always available. I don't have office hours. I spend time with my clients as needed. And if someone wants to talk to me on a Sunday afternoon, as I have one client who only wants to talk to me on Sunday afternoons, that's when I'll talk to them. Prior to doing this, I was a CFO with a software company that I helped sell twice. And then prior to that, I had started with a partner, a little technology services firm. And I started my career at Cooper's Lybrand, which people know more formally now as PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I was a partner there, where I first met Rick, in fact.
Yes. So actually, you and I did meet many years ago. That was pre-kids and grandkids and all that kind of stuff. Your rationale for leaving public accounting was that business owners were talking to you about advice, and you thought to be a better advisor, you wanted to understand the business owner's perspective, so you became one. So what did you enjoy about being a business owner, and how did it help you in your profession?
So enjoy is a kind of a loaded word. I enjoyed the freedom to be really be able to make something. In my personal interests and in my professional interests, I like to build. And so building a company was a challenge and a really rewarding challenge. I will tell you that I learned what I did learn from that experience were the things that I did not expect to learn. Chief among those is to make sure you choose your partners correctly. That can have a lot to do with your overall satisfaction and success of the business.
So any magic wands there and trying to figure that one out?
Well, I picked, or we both picked, we were friends, and that's probably the wrong way to go about picking a business partner. And as a result, I didn't do the kind of due diligence I should have done. He was a sales guy, and he was a talented sales guy. And so with a lot of salespeople, there's a little bit of embellishment that comes along with the story. So, and I believe the embellishment, I probably should have been a little bit more discerning.
All right. So there's always a spectrum on truth and embellishment, and it's somewhere in there.
Right.
All right. All right. So John, you happen to live in Southwest Minneapolis, where I grew up. We talked about that a little bit before today. Wonderful neighborhood, family friendly, restaurants you can walk to. You got the lake, you got the creek, all kinds of things. What are you doing to stay sane and healthy during the stay at home period?
Well, like we talked about, we walk through the neighborhood a lot, which is interesting in this COVID era because there's a lot more people on the streets. My wife and I were always walking the neighborhood as a way of spending time together as well as getting some exercise. And now there's a lot more people on the streets beside us. Otherwise, I like to play guitar and I work in my wood shop. So building stuff in my wood shop, like I mentioned, in my personal time, as well as making music.
And so both are creative and both are creating stuff of value.
Um, yes, but value is always in the eyes of the person observing it as opposed to the one creating it.
All right. Well, hopefully your wife enjoys your guitar playing.
Well, we'll see.
All right. So before we get to an event and talk about what we're going to talk about here today, let's talk about what you, our audience, can receive for participating. Our hashtag today is Cash is King. Put that into the comment field and submit a question if you'd like. We're going to pick 3 winners who will get a 13-week cash flow projection template and 1 hour of John's time on how to use that. So again, it's hashtag Cash is King, and we're going to pick 3 winners at the end here today. So look forward to folks' questions and their participation. So John, first let's start by kind of laying the groundwork. Tell us a little bit about how an outsourced CFO actually works.
So as many CFOs as there are, as many different ways as they work. Inside an organization, CFOs tend to be the number 2 person. And so depending on the organization, a lot of those talents that they build through their career are what comes through, as opposed to, say, a controller who works primarily putting out financial statements, hopefully on a timely, complete, and accurate basis. See, and I often say the controllers work in the past and CFOs work in the future. And so working with a business owner, I'm often trying to figure out what they're looking to get to in the future and how do we bridge that gap between the present and their desired state. And that can involve a lot of different things. It can involve organizational structure. It can involve real assessment of where their product is in the marketplace. A lot of work that I've been doing recently is on pricing and on margin analysis, for instance.
How about charging and then being managed by the business owner? How does that work?
So my fees are dependent on the situation, but I typically bill by the hour, only for the time I incur. And that's an interesting question about how I get managed. Part of the reason I do this is so that I'm not as managed. I can be an outside advisor. And one of the things I really enjoy about this is I can be direct and honest with a business owner, as opposed to being inside an organization where you're probably a little bit more guarded about providing direct, honest feedback to an owner. So in times like these where you're coming up with plan Bs that may be politically or damaging, or they're sacrificial land, they're sacrificial cows that you're trying to stay away from, I can be the person that can suggest those types of changes, knowing that full well that if some of those changes involve eliminating people, I'm probably going to put myself at the top of the list just to be sure that I'm giving an unbiased opinion to my client.
Sure. But in terms of, it's probably project driven. So you reach kind of a scope of work and what you do, and then it's up to you to deliver on that. And then also find things to do on top of that that add value.
That's correct. And what I'm really striving for is a long-term relationship with my client, so that when there's a question, they're not hesitating in calling me and getting my take on a situation.
Sure. So what's the best way to get the most value out of a working relationship with you or any other outsourced C-suite position?
I think by making sure that you're including them in communications. And right now, it's probably a little bit easier in some ways because there's probably a lot more email going on. I was just talking to a couple of people that are CEOs in organizations or in the C-suite, and they're bemoaning the fact that they can't walk down the hall and talk to their other compatriots in the business. And so it's easier to include everybody on an email. And I think that that's part of, I think that's probably the most important part, is that I know what's going on. And so making sure that I'm included in those discussions. Absent that, if I don't hear from somebody, I reach out, I call them up.
Sure. Sure, sure. Well, lots to reach out to them now about. All right, so on to our cash discussion. You came up with this title. Explain what it means to know your cash.
So my experience has been that business owners know their cash historically, and they're very good about, they can tell you how much is in their account. But I think the challenge is to project what the cash is going to look like in a month or 2 months or 3 months. And right now that's been particularly important. And so I think that it's important for business owners to not only know what they're spending their money on, which is typically what they're looking at, but how they're actually generating future inflows of cash. And in introducing some of the things that we're going to talk about, primarily this 13-week cash flow, the challenge has been, when I bring it to a client, is that they want to have their accountants do it, and they should. But accountants who live in the past, as I mentioned, good senior accountants, good controllers, are loath to project the future. They have a difficult time really projecting what their revenue will be. They say, I have no idea what this is. I can't guess the future. And they say, well, you probably have a better knowledge of what the future is by virtue of collecting cash. You know your accounts, you know when they're going to pay, and you can project. You're going to be wrong. Let's just face it. In projecting, you're going to be wrong, but you're going to be less wrong than if you did nothing.
And you mentioned about being honest earlier. You get an opportunity to bring honesty and an unbiased perspective into this conversation.
That's correct. And some of that involves sometimes owner compensation and what's appropriate in light of current events. And sometimes it's being honest about what they're expecting to collect from some accounts and what they're expecting to even do as far as work. Be honest about what you expect is going to come out of a particular customer relationship in terms of future revenue.
Yeah. So what do you recommend to companies to do to actually go through the process to get to know their cash?
So I recommend this 13-week cash flow projection. And it's a weekly project. And when I say project, the first time you set it up is really the project. And then weekly, just updating it for the future. Add another week, and just update the primary drivers in your cash flow. And those drivers are your collection of receivables or your cash sales, and then what expenses you know that are coming down the pike. You know what your primary expenses are. You have payroll, you have rent, you have insurance, and those are going to comprise much of what that projection is. If you're a manufacturer or a reseller, you know what your inventory's got to be because you're projecting some revenue. And so you got to project a matching level of expense to purchase goods for resale or purchase raw materials to manufacture. And so it's a worksheet that you start with. If you saw my template for today, it would be week beginning 5/4, and you'd start with what's in the bank, and you'd add in what you're expecting to collect this week, and you'd subtract out of it your expenses that you're going to pay this week. And at the end of the week, you have a projection and on out for 13 weeks of what your cash is going to be. And then next week, you roll it forward 1 week and you true up the current week for what you think it's going to be. So if you receive some collections earlier than you thought, you take those out, but those will be reflected in increased cash. And if you have some expenses that maybe you had to make a repair on a piece of equipment or something that you weren't anticipating, you can add that in. So those are some examples of how to work through this.
Sure. So I have another question or two on the 13-week cash flow I'd like to ask you, but we got a question from our audience. And again, to participate, it's #CashIsKing to get that 13-week cash flow template from John, as well as an hour of his time. Again, #CashIsKing. All right, from Harold, What did the COVID virus teach us about cash reserves, and how much cash slash liquid assets should a company keep on hand?
Well, that's a really good question. And I always view this in terms of the number of payroll periods you want to have cash on reserve for. And some of this is also relative to your level of willing to take a risk. Most of the clients that I'm working with are trying to have 2 to 3 months worth of payroll in the bank. And I don't know if that's the right number or not, but that's what I work with. And if you have more, that's great. I do have a few clients that do have a little bit more. I'm usually dealing with clients that have less. And so if we're trying to figure out how to say flatten that cash expenditure curve.
Yeah. What about kind of common, I don't know whether it's a mistake or you mentioned earlier about being a little overly optimistic on things and maybe embellishing a little bit. Where do you see people go wrong on their 13-week cash flow? Is it not being conservative enough? What are some of the common things people do wrong when they're building that out?
Well, if it's being prepared, as it's prepared by accountants, they tend to be conservative in when they're going to collect, and they tend to be aggressive in terms of when they're going to pay bills, meaning they don't take advantage of terms maybe the way they should, meaning pay according to your payment terms in normal situations. And we can talk about COVID in a little bit as to what we should do there. And then a business owner will get this and take a look at it, and they'll say, oh no, we're going to collect these other receivables that we don't have on there yet, or we're going to make some new sales that are going to help improve cash flow down the road. In the spreadsheet that I've built, what we can do is play around with scenarios on that. And so we can see what the sensitivity on cash is to some of those things. To more directly answer your question, I think that there is a tendency for people to be more positive about the cash they're going to collect than what actually exists.
So they're cutting back on how they pay and maybe stretching out a little bit, or to the letter of the law, the payment terms, and similar, then the other side is doing the same. So that just maybe a little too much optimism on collecting the cash.
Right. And in the COVID environment, we're seeing a lot of companies really slow down their payments.
What about COVID that tied to that? What about taking on extra debt as a strategy, in the sense of, hey, you got a line of credit, get the cash now, or go to your banker and increase your line of credit? Are you doing that with some of your clients?
I'm not, primarily because they were able to get some of that PPP money.
Okay.
And I had one who also got some EIDL money, which is the other SBA emergency program.
Sure.
I will tell you, these companies have tended to already be close as possible to max that they can. And so, I don't necessarily advise that they take everything out. I certainly want them to be within compliance with whatever covenants they have with the bank.
Sure.
But I think right now you're going to get a lot more value out of your banking relationship if you take the high road. So there used to be a theory in the past that if you knew you were going to have a cash crunch and it was going to be tough, you'd go and you'd take your line down to the max. I think that'll backfire, and it can damage your banking relationship. And I think the better way of dealing with that is to be upfront with the bank and go visit the banker and say, I've got a rough patch coming up. Let's work through this together.
Okay.
And involving your banker in that discussion is going to get you a lot further than taking down a bunch of cash that you are probably going to be breaking covenant doing.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions for you, but before we move on, any other thoughts on that 13-week cash flow, what actually it looks like, or anything about the process that you go through?
So I spend some time going through it with my clients' accountants to make sure they're comfortable with it. And I'll take a look at it the first times through in a more deeper dive to challenge some of their assumptions that they're making. But the people that I've worked with have been pretty good about picking it up. And I will tell you, I have one client who I thought was doing a 13-week cash flow projection because I had talked about it with his accountant and they had not. And I got a frantic call in February about that. And he feels like he's in a much better control of his business now that he has really done it. We've gone through it, and he feels completely, and this is the same guy that got EIDL money, and he feels in complete control of what his destiny is, and he can make decisions based on that he felt like he was flying blind before knowing about
Okay.
this tool.
So what are the levers that a company can work on to change their cash position? Tell us a little bit about that.
So the easy one to work on is your expenses. And I say that easy, it's easy to talk about, sometimes hard to execute. So what that means is, you got to take a look at all your expenses. What are the ones that you need to have? And what are the ones that are nice to have? And what are the ones that are just pure luxuries? And so taking a look at all those expenses, you need payroll. And so you're not going to be able to eliminate payroll, or at least most of payroll. You probably have some flexibility with rent. And so what I'm seeing a lot of, and I'm suggesting to my clients is, have you sought a rent holiday or a rent reduction from your landlord? And there's probably not a lot they're going to be able to do to you in the near term, because everybody's in the same situation. And what I'm seeing now from landlords is a lot of them are volunteering rent holidays or a reduction. I mean, they want everybody to succeed as well. Otherwise, there's no business left. The harder situation in controlling your cash position is revenue. And what are you going to do to increase revenue? And part of that is to understand your revenue streams, understand your margins. And that's where, I've been spending this time working with clients on their pricing. And are they getting as much as they should for what they're doing? And a lot of times business owners, especially in service businesses, will under charge for what they're providing their customers. And so it's really helping owners take an honest look at what they're providing to their customers in terms of goods or services, and helping them understand how much they're making and how much they should be making.
All right. And then one of the other things you talked about, renegotiating with the landlords. Maybe there's some other things that you might renegotiate, or also possibly requesting looser payment terms.
So seeing that a little bit in insurance, property and casualty insurance, not so much in benefits, but seeing that in property and casualty insurance. And some of those brokers are being flexible with respect to payment terms more than amount, but payment terms on insurance.
Okay. And then you talked a little bit about the revenue and the understanding the margins, but talk about how companies can deal with the revenue and the receivables as part of this cash flow, part of its margin, some of its customer concentration. Talk a little bit about this issue.
So the good question is, what is the collection process? Because a lot of times when we're talking about the 13-week cash flow projection, we're assuming that we're going to collect receivables at a certain point in time. And the challenge is getting those receivables paid when we want them to be paid. And in this environment, everybody's trying to slow that down. And so I think that, like with your banker, staying close to your customers and being honest with them about the fact that, if you want us to continue to provide service, we need to get something. Now, do you offer a discount in the near term, or do you offer more relaxed payment terms, but maybe get it over a period of time? So instead of someone taking 90 days to pay, who usually paid 30, can I get a third at 30, a third at 60, and a third at 90? So it's a matter of being creative. We have a bunch of business terms. A lot of times business owners will say, these are my terms. Well, the only reason they're your terms is that you've defined them to be your terms. And right now is a good time to say, can we redefine what the terms are to improve our cash flow and our operations?
Sure. So I have another question. And again, to remind our audience, hashtag cash flows king, cash is king. Question from Zach. What strategies do you recommend for increasing AP terms? And what is a good rate to target for fast payments, i.e. 3% for net 30? And is it better to target a discount slash rebate percent or net 60?
Well, there's a lot there. So let's
Okay,
start.
one at a time. What strategies do you recommend for increasing AP terms?
I'd reach out to my vendors, and I'd sort my vendors too as to who's most important and what relationships do you really that are really key. Um, the ones that are less key, I think you have more flexibility with, because you can define it as more flexible.
Mhm.
If you don't need it as much, then you don't need to pay for it as quickly. But with your key vendors, um, I think reaching out and having an honest discussion with them about, I want to stay open, I want to pay you, I can't pay you. Can we come to an understanding that we can loosen up these terms? I mean, there's not so much science involved here as much as negotiation,
Sure.
understanding who you're paying and what you're paying them, and understanding where you are in their food chain and where they are in your food chain.
Okay. Now drilling down a little bit, what is a good rate to target for fast payments? Something, do you give them a 3% discount for net 10? Or what's a fair discount in your mind for folks that are willing to pay quickly?
I'd say 1 to 2% for net 10. That's a pretty good annual rate. Um, I think that's fair. Um, Net 30, yeah, or yeah, so 2% net 10 is pretty significant.
Okay. What about, or is it better to target discounts and rebates on a net 60?
I wouldn't do that. I mean, I don't think you're getting anything, and you need the cash sooner than you need it later, and 60 is still a long way out.
Okay. All right. Again, hashtag cash is king. Submit your question to John, as well as get in a drawing for a free template on the 13-week cash flow in an hour at John's time to go through that. Any other thoughts as it relates to managing your cash, like the burn, your break even? How do you flatten the curve? Any of those things around the cash burn?
So flattening the curve to me means that you understand where your problems are going to be, and that you'll get from the 13-week cash flow. And then the next step after that is to understand what is your monthly cash burn. And if you remove some discretionary expenses, what does that do to your burn? And when you do that, you're also figuring out what your break even is. And ultimately, you're trying to stay below the break even in terms of what you're burning. And then through those two things, you should be able to see the effect of flattening that curve. And when I say flatten that curve, I mean that hump of cash outage as opposed to cash inflow.
Sure, sure.
So those are the couple things that can be natural byproducts of this 13-week cash flow.
Sure. And when you're working through in a time like this where everybody's scrutinizing their budgets and looking for ways to save a few dollars here and there, as well as prioritizing what's most important, as you mentioned, what's a necessity, what's a must have versus a nice to have. Has there been any common threads, any things you've seen over the last, 5, 6 weeks where they've had this heightened sense of scrutiny on the income statement? Anything that you can draw from this last month and a half that you can share with our audience?
Well, the easy one has been travel, because no one's traveling. So that's kind of an instant byproduct. But some of the things that I've seen, eliminating cleaning services in the office. just because no one's there. Even if it gets dusty, you can call them back in when we go back to the office. So that's been one that I've seen fairly frequently. Um, Cutting back on some of the extras related to, and this is a culture thing too. If you're used to having food in the organization when you come back, that's something that I would cut back on. Entertainment that might get pushed through, I'd cut back on. A lot of this is business owner driven, and it's being honest with the business owner and saying, do you really need to spend company money on this kind of thing? Um, you know, should the business owner be taking a cut and pay? There have been organizations I've been working with where the executive team have taken 20 to 30% cuts in their salary.
Mhm.
So those are some of the things that are sobering discussions, but are the ones that will help companies get through this.
Sure. How about managing 1099 contractors? A lot of organizations have built a team around 1099s. I have relationships like that. You do. A lot of those folks are critical to a business. Yet you got a business who's going through some tough times and they're trying to manage those times. How do they reach out to in a professional way that keeps the relationship positive with their 1099 folks, but yet maybe get some of the flexibility that they're looking for?
So a number of my clients have those kinds of relationships, and I'll talk about me as a separate part of that, um, because I'm certainly a 1099 consultant to these businesses, and they're taking a serious look at what those 1099 providers are delivering and scaling them back typically, or eliminating them for the time being. So for instance, and I'm not picking on anybody, but what I've seen is HR 1099 HR types of professionals are seeing are getting cut back quite a bit. Same with marketing and advertising kind of revenue and delivery. Now, for me, I went into this with a different attitude, and that is, I know my clients need me, and I know that they don't necessarily have the cash right now to pay me. And so I've on a case by case basis, I've worked with them to say, I'm more interested in you getting through this because we're both going to be better off at the other end of this.
Yep.
And I think a lot of the 1099 providers are going to feel that way.
Yep. Yep. Good idea. Good suggestion. Thank you for that. Any other final kind of closing thoughts, perspectives, anything else that you'd like to share with our audience here today?
The only thing that I'll add, and this is maybe a non sequitur, is that I always believe that simple is best. Um, but simple is hard to get to. I think there's real genius in simplicity. And so I always strive to try and help companies figure out what is the simple way. Accountants and lawyers, we like to make things really complicated because it's a cool organization structure that we can talk about, with our buddies in the accounting and lawyer communities. When really what we're trying to communicate is take the fluff and the glitz out, or the added decoration out of it, and pare it back so people know what's going on in their business. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do is help tell a story to a business owner about what's going on in their business. And that's what we're trying to do with this 13-week cash flow, is tell the story of what your cash is doing and make it understandable to a business owner so that they have a better sense of where their cash is, and they have a better sense of control and actual control.
Right. And as I mentioned, hashtag cash is king. If you want your name in the drawing to get that 13-week cash flow template from John, as well as an hour at a time working through that. We were trading emails about this talk today, and a million years ago when I was at Piper, a gentleman had said that cash is king and even more important than your mother. So, John, one last question would be anything along those lines that you'd like to add about experiences you've had here in this last 6 weeks that have been really challenging, or or anything else you want to share?
I don't know that I have anything as good as that.
Okay. All right.
But
All
it's,
right.
I
So
mean,
John, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, your email address again is?
John Morris, all one word, JOHNMORRIS @ B as in boy, the number 2, B